India is playing host this week. The Nepalese Prime Minister is in town. Pushp Kamal Dahal, aka Prachanda, he took office in December 2022. He is the latest in Nepal's musical chair of Prime Ministers. It promises to be a very consequential visit. For starters, it's his first since taking office. Prachanda had invitations from India and China, but he chose India first. That's a good sign. He also put a Chinese military deal on hold before coming here. Again, good sign. His visit to India was delayed and postponed multiple times. When asked about this, Prachanda had an interesting answer. He said he was doing his homework. Prachanda has come with a massive delegation, around 88 people including ministers and businessmen. He is slated to meet India's President, Vice President and of course the Prime Minister. His meeting with Prime Minister Modi will happen tomorrow. Both sides are clear about what they want. Nepal is hoping for two things. One is a reset in ties. Nepal-India relations have been through a tough phase. Former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli claimed Indian territories by releasing a new map. This led to a diplomatic conflict of sorts. Beijing was seen cozying up to Kathmandu, but Prachanda will be hoping to clean the slate, to get things back on track. Number two, he will be hoping for some deliverables, like more flights between the two countries, more trade and investments, and most importantly, permission to export electricity to Bangladesh. Both Dhaka and Kathmandu are keen, but since they don't share a border, they will have to use India's grid. Prachanda will be hoping for an all clear. And what will India be hoping for? A reset would be good news for India as well. But China is the elephant in the room. New Delhi has traditionally been the chief military and economic partner for Kathmandu. Now Beijing wants in. You see, China has boosted trade and investment with Nepal. So what India wants is assurances, a promise that Nepal will put India first over China. It's a policy that is pursued towards the whole of South Asia. The Maldives, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all of them. The question is, will Nepal agree? After all, Kathmandu has its own strategic considerations. It would make sense to play India and China against each other, sort of like best of both worlds. In fact, Nepal did that right up to the pandemic. But recently, there has been a rethink. Like I said, Prachanda chose to visit India before China. He also put a military deal on hold. What explains this? Perhaps recent developments in the region. Just look at what happened in Sri Lanka. Chinese debt pushed the country into financial ruin. But even then, India stood by and helped. It gave assistance worth $4 billion. This has reinforced India's position as a reliable partner in South Asia. Hence, the much-hyped visit by Prachanda. Having said that, there's little scope for trouble. Prachanda belongs to the Communist Party of Nepal. It is considered close to Beijing. Many leaders of the party have demanded a hawkish position, like KP Sharma Oli. He wants Prachanda to raise the border issue with India. Others want a review of the 1950 Friendship Treaty. Both issues will put India off. So Prachanda needs to make a calculated decision. Indications are he will steer clear from controversies, maybe focus only on deliverables. If not, things could get uncomfortable. As for India, the brief is simple. Offer more support and assistance to Nepal, build stronger people-to-people ties. That last one is very important. Nepal and India do share strong cultural and religious ties, but those can't be taken for granted. Recently, Nepalese leaders have tried to drum up anti-India sentiments. KP Sharma Oli's revised map was the perfect example. To tackle that, India needs to build confidence. It needs to create a relationship based on trust and equality. We'll be tracking tomorrow's bilateral closely. Russia is under attack again. Yesterday, Moscow was struck by drones. Today, a refinery has been targeted. This one in Russia's Krasnodar region. Pictures showed a fire engulfing the refinery. It was later put out by the local authorities. Casualties? None so far. But what caused this fire? Russia is blaming Ukraine. They say Kyiv launched a drone strike on the refinery. And that's just one attack. A separate one was reported in the Belgorod region. That one killed at least one Russian citizen. Again, Ukraine has been blamed. But how credible are these allegations? Kyiv has been silent so far. Russia has repeatedly blamed them for attacks inside Russian territory. But every time Kyiv has denied it, perhaps it's Ukraine's strategy to avoid escalation. Or maybe Russia is bluffing. Either way, the frequency of these attacks are growing. We've seen drones over Moscow, railway sabotages, bridges being blown up, and multiple refineries being targeted. The Russian president has reacted to these incidents. He says there are terror attacks.
As you know, the Kyiv regime has chosen a different path. The path of attempts to intimidate Russia, Russian citizens, and attacks on residential buildings. This is, of course, a clear sign of terrorist activities. First, I want to say that the Moscow air defense system worked in the regular way, although there are things for us to work on.
There are many ways to look at this. From Ukraine's perspective, these attacks give them more leverage. It puts fear in the mind of Russian citizens, which means indirect pressure on Moscow. From Russia's perspective, it's the perfect excuse. They can just say, look, Ukraine is attacking us, so we are escalating. But which of these is true? I'm afraid it's impossible to know because, as they say, truth is the first casualty of war. For the moment, let's assume Kyiv is behind these attacks. Do they have Western blessings for it? That's the tricky part. The US and Britain seem to have different policies. The White House says, don't attack Russia. The UK says, by all means. Listen to this.
Look, we do not support attacks inside of Russia. That's it, period. I mean, I cannot be any more clear than what I just stated. We do not support attacks inside of Russia, period.
It does also have the right to project force beyond its borders to undermine Russia's ability to project force into Ukraine itself. So legitimate military targets beyond its own border are part of Ukraine's self-defense.
So where does that leave Ukraine? In a bit of a pickle. President Zelensky is trying out a very delicate balancing act. Publicly, he says this is a defensive war, a war that has been forced upon Ukraine. But privately, he wants more aggressive tactics. That's what leaked documents from the Pentagon show. 3 audacious missions stand out. Zelensky wanted to occupy Russian border villages. He wanted to strike a pipeline carrying Russian oil to Hungary. And he wanted long-range missiles to hit Russian targets. NATO has given him long-range missiles. But that supply came on one condition, that those missiles will be used for defense and not offense. So far, the promise has been kept. Long-range missiles have not been used to hit Russian targets. Instead, we have seen unconventional methods, like Russian militias aligned to Ukraine or low-cost drones. There's logic to using these methods. You see, Russia's air defenses are designed to deter missiles. But low-flying drones, not so much. Listen in to this expert.
Russian air defenses, particularly around Moscow, are oriented on a different kind of threat. They are oriented on missiles, ballistic missiles, regional missiles, aircraft, bombers, but not short-range drones, which might be flying very low over the ground, for example. The Russians have been focused on the United States and what it could do, and not on what one of its neighbors might do with these relatively short-range drones.
That could be one reason. The idea of these attacks isn't to overpower Russia. That's virtually impossible. The idea is to put pressure on Putin, to make Russian citizens feel insecure and hence raise their voice. But is it working? Well, yes and no. The attacks have caught the Wagner Group's attention. Their chief is blaming the Russian Defense Ministry, once again in colorful language. Listen in.
The fact that they fly to Rubliovka, to your home, the hell with it, let your houses burn. And what do ordinary people do when drones with explosives crash into their windows? And therefore, as a citizen, I'm deeply indignant.
So there has been an impact, but not like mass paranoia. We're not seeing Russian citizens flooding bomb shelters, and that's the downside. Russia could use these attacks to step up the fighting. We are already seeing evidence of that. The city of Kyiv was attacked thrice in 24 hours this week. So in conclusion, let me say this. The attacks inside Russia represent a new phase of this war. This time, Ukraine is making the moves and Russia is on the receiving end. But how long will Putin let that slide? We'll find out soon enough. Now let's turn our attention to North Korea. The country had planned to launch a satellite by June 11. Why? To monitor US military activities. And it tried doing so, but failed. North Korea's first space satellite crashed into the sea. But while the satellite failed to do its job, it succeeded in one thing: creating panic. The launch sparked a false alarm in the South Korean capital of Seoul. Japan also issued a warning to its residents of Okinawa. There were air raid sirens blaring, emergency messages passing around. There was chaos and confusion as people tried to save their lives, only to be told 20 minutes later that there had been an error. Our next report tells you more about it. What you just heard were wailing air raid sirens in South Korea's Seoul and Japan's Okinawa. This was followed by mobile phone alerts. They called for evacuations, which is rare. All this happened on Wednesday morning. People awoke to the confusion. Residents were rattled. Reports say people were frantically running for cover. Some grabbed their children and hid. Others started making calls to their loved ones. Many were frantically dialing the emergency numbers. Some even went online to check what had happened, but internet was slow.
I was a little confused by the alert message this morning.
I thought it was an earthquake, but when I looked, it was a missile.
This panic and pandemonium went on for about 20 minutes, after which both Japan and South Korean governments clarified. There was no missile attack. In fact, it was a failed satellite launch by North Korea. Pyongyang had launched its first space satellite, only it was a failure, crashing into the West Sea of Korea, but it was successful in sparking a false alarm in South Korea and Japan, because both the countries were unsure about what had just happened, and they jumped to conclusions.
Today, an object that appears to be a ballistic missile was launched by North Korea.
However, both South Korea and Japan were completely wrong, and now they have apologized.
I apologize for causing confusion over Seoul City's emergency alert message on North Korea's space launch vehicle this morning. This emergency message could be a working level official's overreaction, but it was not a mistake. Our principle is to respond in a manner that can be seen as excessive, and there can be no compromise on safety.
Residents of both these countries live under constant threat, thanks to their neighbor, North Korea. North and South Korea are still technically at war, even though 7 decades have passed since the Korean War ended in an armistice. And now, Pyongyang under Kim Jong-un is amping up its aggression, especially as it plans to expand its nuclear arsenal, to apply pressure on both Washington and Seoul. But that being said, this latest move by North Korea has angered South Korea and Japan. Their citizens are upset too, not with Pyongyang, but their own governments.
How do they ensure that they can trust in their local authorities? And I feel like every time in this case, if we're talking about North Korea, every time that North Korea fires a missile of some sort, and there's possibility that it may either fly over Hokkaido or be landing within Japan's EEZ.
While people are justifiably angry over this false alarm, the threat is very real, because North Korea is clearly on a war path, and the war clouds over Japan and South Korea are looming large. And one day, they may actually rain fire. Would you want to take a flight from New Zealand? Keep your phone and keys aside, remove your shoes, and get ready to step on the scale. That's right, because New Zealand's Civil Aviation Authority is demanding a passenger weight survey. This new program will apply to Air New Zealand for passengers departing on international flights. It will begin July onwards and help the airline gather data on passenger weight. Why? So the Aviation Authority can understand weight load and distribution for planes. And this has become part of a much bigger debate. People are weighing in on this new program, and the reactions are mixed. But Air New Zealand is not the first flight to incorporate a weight survey. We tell you more about it in our next report.
Women's magazines and aircraft. Do you know what the two have in common? They both want you to watch your weight. It's true, aircraft are obsessed with weight, so they weigh everything they carry. From cargo to meals on board to luggage, and it only makes sense that now they want to weigh their customers as well. We're talking about New Zealand. Their Civil Aviation Authority is launching a new program, a passenger weight survey. It's for passengers departing on international flights of Air New Zealand, which is the country's national airline. But why is this survey required? Are they trying to body shame you? Definitely not, says the Aviation Authority. Why then? They say it's to gather data on weight load. It'll help them distribute weight correctly overall. Air New Zealand has called this measure essential to ensure the safe and efficient operation of the aircraft. And they are right. Aircraft have always weighed everything. You already know that. This includes their crew and passengers. Just that they usually assume this weight. They call it assumed mass. It's an estimate of the total weight of the passengers. They use set figures for this. Think of it as an average number that they apply. But this is far from accurate. Airlines often use only gender to assume weight. So two passengers of the same gender will fit into the same weight average. In reality, though, there might be a big difference in their respective weights. What's more, measuring weight also has environmental benefits. Aircraft crew loads fuel based on the assumed weight. For instance, if the actual weight is less than the assumed weight, then lesser fuel will be required. So it's important to get the numbers right, which is where this survey comes in. And New Zealand knows this, because this isn't the first time they're holding this survey. Flyers on the domestic network were weighed in 2021. There were plans to weigh international flyers too, but the pandemic hit and the program was halted. Now that international travel has resumed, so can the weight measuring program. And New Zealand is not the only country to consider a weight survey. Uzbekistan did it in 2015, Finland and Hawaii in 2017. But despite the benefits of a weight survey, many are not in favor of this program. That's because weight is a personal thing. Most are not comfortable disclosing it. Stepping on scales in public can be a daunting experience. Which is why New Zealand is doing its bit to make customers feel safe. Its travelers will stand on a digital scale, which will calculate their weight and automatically submit it to the survey. The weight will not be displayed on the agent's screen, thus protecting the privacy of the passengers. Plus, it's completely voluntary. So, will the freedom of choice make it comfortable for travelers? New Zealand sure hopes so. These weighty matters can't be taken lightly. But if you do watch your weight, remember, you're lessening the load on the aircraft and the planet, quite literally.
We talked about the Ukraine war. It has led to the displacement of millions. Around 8 million Ukrainians have crossed over to Europe. No hassles, no delays. They were welcomed with open arms. Now compare that to Afghan refugees. Tens of thousands of them have reached the EU borders. They are awaiting resettlement. But I'm afraid it's an endless wait. Let me tell you what an international charity has found. Around 270,000 Afghans need permanent protection, meaning resettlement. Guess how many actually got it in 2022? Just 271. We did the math. That's 0.1% of the Afghans who needed resettlement. So much for Europe's open arms. Only 271 out of 270,000 Afghans have been resettled. And the rest? Well, they are living in camps on Greek islands. Quick side note, Greece is often called the gateway to Europe. It's the assembly point for most refugees, but their camps are horrible. This charity's report describes them as prison-like. It also accuses the EU of staggering neglect. In 2021, Germany set up a scheme to resettle 1,000 Afghans every month. And how many did they? 0 under that scheme. Italy has taken in half of what they promised, and some countries did not even bother. Austria refused to take in more Afghan refugees. So did Serbia and Poland. They simply shut the door. So thousands of Afghans were trapped in Greek camps. Their living conditions are bad but their mental health is worse. Around 90% of them reported anxiety. 86% reported symptoms of depression. The obvious question is, why isn't the EU taking them in? It's not resources for sure. We just told you how Europe welcomed 8 million Ukrainians. What is 270,000 compared to that? So the only answer is racism. Europe doesn't have a problem with white European refugees, but it has a problem with Afghans. Take Poland, for example. They've done great work for Ukrainians. Around 1.3 million refugees are still living there. But let me tell you how that same Poland treated Afghans. In 2021, they trapped 32 Afghans at their border with Belarus. They refused to let them apply for asylum. Just think about it. Red carpet for 1.3 million Ukrainians, iron fence for 32 Afghans. If this isn't racism, what is? The fact is, Europe has a responsibility to these people. They had no problems marching in to Afghanistan with NATO, nor with occupying the country for 2 decades. But when it comes to refugees, they have no time or resources. So what's the solution? The EU has been asked to scale up the process. They have also given a target. Resettle at least 42,500 Afghans in the next 5 years. Ideally, it shouldn't take that long, but knowing the EU, even that target is impossible.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.